Former Premier of South Australia, Mike Rann, talking from Rome, and may I say this is a wonderful example of bipartisan work, you know, Liberal, Labor, didn't matter. Good people working together. Now, formerly, Peter Yates talked about these stories coming out and you're being hit by more and more stories coming from sources. Now, to some extent, this can seem confusing. There's a new story that possibly negates the old story. Think of food. 1 minute, bacon's a problem. Before that, 2 weeks ago, fructose in fruit juice was a problem. 1 minute, statins are a problem. Then they're exonerated 2 weeks later. Where do you go? Is it a problem that we're not telling the full story of where these revelations come from? So that I actually was doing this in the ABC, trying to get something called Babel fish, as invented by Douglas Adams, the late Miss Douglas Adams. Babel fish was a fish you put in your ear and enabled you to talk all the languages in the universe and understand them. And what I was thinking of doing is having a 1 hour program, if you like, a background briefing, which would tell you about something like the history of AIDS, the history of vaccinations, something to do with life on Mars, and you could have the history of it and update it with the latest revelation so that you knew where that stuff came from. Now the question is, should the Science Media Centre tell something like a bigger story to connect the gaps? Is this a problem? Susan Greenfield, you, as a person who's watching the media, feel it is.
Do I get the mic? Oh, no, I've got my...
You have a mic.
Oh, very good. Well, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. When I was a thinker in residence, we actually had a mock-up number plate for South Australia, a state of mind. Isn't that wonderful? So I think in that spirit. Okay, so to answer your question, I think one of the issues is that science is always provisional. And this poses a problem on two fronts. One is you're bang on talking about stories. Everyone loves stories. If I said now, once upon a time, you'd all be engaged. Yeah? We like a beginning, a middle, and an end. And traditionally with the media, not science, you have a story. The kitten is trapped up a tree. The fireman come along and hopefully rescue kitten. Old lady, happy. End of story, right? So you have a very clear-cut, definitive story. But because science is provisional, you don't have that closure, nor do you have an easy background. So in order to tell a science story, you would need to have a lot of background before the event, the equivalent of the cat up the tree, and then you'd say, well, perhaps it'll survive, perhaps it won't, who knows? You know, you wouldn't be able to sign off. You wouldn't be able to sign off because science is provision. Now, that leads to a further problem that, again, people find hard to cope with because they've been brainwashed to think that scientists are infallible and perfect and know everything. So how come they're disagreeing? How come they don't all say it's the same thing? And how come they don't know the answer? How come they're speaking the subjunctive? It may be the case, perhaps, it could be, that in here, because, again, we're trained to be highly provisional, highly using the subjunctive, highly conditional, because something else new might come along and trump us. And I think these are two very fundamental problems with packaging a science story. That's not to say they're insuperable, but up until now, they haven't been recognized. And I think the Media Centre, the Media Centre here is doing a fantastic job in perhaps getting around those two things.
Peter Fray, journalist. Now you're a professor.
Apparently.
Tell me, fragmentation of knowledge, is there a problem and could we solve it?
Well, yes and no. Sorry to answer it like that, but...
you sound like a politician.
Must be a scientist already. You're provisional. Well, just on that point, though, of being provisional, I mean, I think let's understand a few basics about how the media works. The media works traditionally in a conflict model, right? A says this, B says that, there's conflict. And where science has always fit into that has been the kind of relief from the conflict. But I see signs that this is changing. So that essentially the way we are receiving content now is invariably on one of these things. The most important publisher in the world now is Facebook. Let's accept that as our new reality. And I think there's two other points to say about fragmentation. The media is fragmenting. The distribution model of the media, because of digital tools, was the thing that blew up the traditional revenue model. It's the distribution model. We now have so many other tools and so many other ways of telling story. And if you look at some of the kind of key trends in storytelling, they really feed into science. data journalism is science. Virtual reality storytelling, using virtual reality to tell science, it is science. Automation, robo-journalism is
sure,
science.
that would be fine if these sources were connected, but they all seem to come from their own situation. This is so, this is so. And if you're a member of the public, you can actually look up something that only confirms your own belief.
Well, I think we need to understand another fundamental thing that's going on, which is one of the main reasons why people share stories, and one of the main reasons, the recent book by Hal Crawford and Adrian Hunter is a great read on this, is a thing called teaming. And the idea of teaming is that people want to share their point of view. So, but the point that I'm making, I think the fundamental point is there has to be a point of view to share. So therefore you need science and scientists.
Tanya Monroe next. Now, you're the person who's often interviewed about any number of subjects. How do you find all this?
Look, I mean, reflecting on the conversation so far, I guess a couple of points. I think we've got to address the fact that culturally, scientists are discouraged from talking outside their area of deep expertise. And yet all the problems that we need to talk about in the media do have that breadth. And so we need to somehow loosen up the culture so that we do encourage people, scientists, to talk outside their area.
Have another mic.
Thank you. This one work better? No. This one doesn't work better?
Have Robbins.
I'll have Robbins then.
Silence
there you
Robin.
go. I'm going now.
No.
Excellent. So I think scientists do need to be encouraged to not feel limited to only talking in their area of deep expertise. I do agree with your point that we need to reveal and uncover the science beneath many of the things people are passionately interested in. I think that's another. But I think also sometimes we need to be a little bit more careful with our language and to pick something close-ish to my area of expertise. A lot of the fear around nanotechnology, and if you look in Australia, the sunscreen scare of recent years, if you look back, a lot of the concepts in nanotechnology that were frightening to the public at the time were really colloidal chemistry, which was a well-established field, but as soon as you change the language, you introduce a new fear.
So can I jump in on one thing?
Yeah, can I jump in as well?
Susan, you jump in, and then Peter.
Yeah, can I jump in before you?
You jump in before me, I know.
Yeah, because Tanya, I think, has raised, Tanya's raised a brilliant point, as have you, so I'll jump in, you can jump back at me.
Okay, there's a lot of jumping going on.
We're all jumping around. Okay, so first I think Tanya's raised a really important point about the recruitment of scientists, because this whole exercise only works if you've got the scientists who are media savvy, media friendly, and so on. And part of the mindset that we're all brought up with is that, you have, it's the equivalent, the science equivalent of Oliver Cromwell, 1602 to 1602 and a half or something, your special subject from which you do not deviate, because you would then get trumped by someone who had done Oliver Cromwell 1603, 1604, and then you'd get trumped by that. So scientists are very wary about putting their head above the parapet without realizing that in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and the very basic knowledge that they have is good enough. That's just fine. In fact, it can be a blessing because they don't get too complicated. But I think we need to really engage and persuade scientists of all ages and generations to do this and to help them, because there is a fear that they will be looked down upon by their peers. They'll be perceived as making something too facile or easy, when of course it's really serious. And I think these are cultural issues that again are not insuperable, but can be addressed. And then to address your point, then you can jump
Brian
back.
Cox doesn't seem trapped. He
So
talks
your
about
point
everything.
But I'd argue that Brian's not trying to forge his way in the world of science.
No, he's not. He's not. And then the second issue that I think is really important is in our flirtation and impressions with the high-tech multimedia and so on, we often conflate information with knowledge. And I think it's all very well to be bombarded with lots of dots, but you have to join the dots up, and someone has to help you join the dots up. So yes, facts and images and all come thick and fast. Now we need someone to provide a framework, a concept, a way of understanding things, instead of just tweeting back immediately. Why don't we have a way of reflecting and thinking about what it all means? And I think that's what's lacking at the moment with science communication. It's not so much we don't have access to facts if you want them, and if you're interested in one subject or another, of course you can do that. But what does it mean?
So
how do you understand it? That's
absolutely.
what I think.
Peter, you have
So, touching back on that conflict model of journalism, if you read media, consume media, you will see that it's dominated often by journalists who need to go and find lobbyists and advocates. And those people are often not fact-based because they're pushing a barrel, they're pushing it's politics, it's social commentary, what have you. So I think the model that science, and I think in the sense the Science Media Centre does this, is to frame this in a kind of advocacy sort of paradigm as well. So what scientists need to be thinking about is they're advocating for some formation of the truth. And then they are going to enter the media space in a lot more regular basis. I think it's there to be done. You know?
You're not implying that the public wants this conflict model, because as far as I can see, it drives us bonkers.
Well, the conflict model exists because it's a very cheap, easy, quick way of getting out news.
No, there's a huge difference. You may contradict me here, jump in, between the UK and Australia, because I have had experience of the media on both, as a victim of both. And certainly whenever I've done interviews, TV, radio, with yourself included, in Australia, I find on the whole, it's not that you don't give me a hard time, but it's more reflective. It's less personalised. You play the batter, not the person, if that's the phrase. Yeah. In England, there seems to be much more a premium on creating aggro, at the expense of the facts.
It's the market. You're talking about the market dynamics, aren't you?
So, but I'm just saying there's a difference in the two countries, which you ought to be very proud of, which is where one can have a reasoned discussion in a sensible amount of time rather than 2 sound bites, where people, I hope, that are watching or listening, leave that programme actually reflecting and thinking and talking in a way perhaps in the UK we've lost that because everyone wants blood and nothing else. Yeah.
Tanya, is that your experience, that we don't want blood, that we just want to help you tell your story?
I think it is, but I think a nuance to that is that one of the pitfalls we find is that without the right type of resource or support like the AusSMC, you try to explain how the latest advance that might have got published in Nature or whatever it is, it will contribute to the world, and the headline always comes up, "Will cure cancer." I've had this experience this year, headline on the front page of the Advertiser, professor's work will cure cancer, and it's like, it's not quite what I said.
No.
And I do
Nothing
worry,
remotely like what you said.
so I do worry that actually, in some sense, desensitises the public or dumbs down the capacity of the public to actually understand what it is that's been done.
You see, one of the great problems we have, and Peter might like to comment on that, is that people like me are sometimes seen as cheerleaders for science. We're not doing that. We're just asking difficult questions nicely,
indeed.
we hope.
Yeah, that's the whole issue. Do it in a way that encourages reflection and thought and dot joining, rather than just chopping people off at the knees.
That's right. If we're not snarling at you,
right.
sometimes viewers think we're being too nice.
And I know you're not really. Secretly, I know.
Peter, will this work, a new paradigm for
I think it will work, and I think there is a desire out there for that sort of debate. And I think, as I say, that for instance, if you look at some of the newer apps and such like that are around, say take something like Upworthy, that is based on a model of engendering empathy, which is completely out of the sort of news paradigm. It's actually about people understanding the place they live in and actually kind of getting on. Now, I'm not saying everyone's going to suddenly get all more empathetic and hold hands and kiss each other or what have you, but I do think that that we've been freed from that model. What I'm trying to say is that I think we are more freed from that model, and I think there is, and that represents what people actually, a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people want.
Yeah, I think I've got 2 thoughts. One of which I'm a bit nervous to say in Australia, which is, imagine if science, deep breath, was like sport. Now, I know this is a dangerous territory now.
No, it's not. It's fine.
Because with sport, some people play it a lot, some people don't play it at all. Some people are professionals at it, some people play it at a weekend, serious level. Many people are interested in watching it and engaging. They wouldn't consider themselves experts. Others might have a favourite football team or whatever and be experts. So you have whole ranges of interest in sport, from the professional sportsman through to the couch potato who occasionally has one. But nonetheless, it's part of the culture, and it's interesting, and it can function at all those different levels. And my dream is the science is like that. You have the professional scientists, you have the people that drill down in depth, you have the people that engage occasionally, you have the people who watch the highlights, and so on. And
as long as someone wins and someone loses.
Well, I mean, to build on that,
to
build on that concept, I think one of the barriers, one of the gaps that we've got is around the perception that science and maths in particular are hard.
Yeah.
And I think we need to get better at telling the stories about what science is. I mean, it's the asking of the questions.
Yeah.
It's the building on the knowledge, that contextual. Things are often presented as these extraordinary leaps, where in reality it's the connecting together of 2 ideas. And if you explained it in that way, it's not such an alienatingly difficult thing.
As you will hear on the Science Show this week, where Adam Spencer talks about The World of Numbers, which is his latest book, and going around the country, I asked Adam Spencer, how do young people respond to your talking about maths? They can't get enough, he says. If you talk to them sensibly, and he does it in a sense of fun, they can't get enough. It's wonderful. I'm reminded to some extent of the Prime Minister's award for a science teacher in a primary school, with a little boy saying, are you open on Saturday? Can I come in then as well? Yeah. You know, it does work.
I think there's also another really important aspect which we can only just touch on the surface now, which is the cultural social aspects, and I'll raise two which are very dear and important. One is the issue of women in science, and retaining and recruiting women in science, because that's lamentable in both the UK and Australia at the moment. How do we engage schoolgirls and get them excited? And I was on the John Frayne show recently with 2 other women scientists. And it's really funny because we said, that's great, we've got 3 women scientists on. I said, well, I can't mention that, it's not politically correct. And we said, well, we can and we will. And we did, yeah. So, but he thought he couldn't do that. But so I think it's really important to be sensitive, to put on female role models, to talk about issues with women in science, to ventilate them, to be honest about them. And the other issue which we've been speaking about, that the Prime Minister I know holds dear, which is science can't anymore live in an ivory tower. It has to get there, back into the powerhouse. It has to be the engine of innovation. And both Tanya and I have had experience of living in both those cultures, of within an academic environment and then spinning out companies and monetarizing your science. We cannot ignore this, and we're not doing it fully enough in both countries. There's a whole load of issues that we don't have time to rehearse,
Tanya.
but now is the time to do that. And I think these cultural things, women in science, spinning out companies, are essential. They're not just nice to have, these should be central.
And I think both of those, to follow up both of those, it's tremendously exciting to see that Australia is actually following from the learnings in the UK of the Athena Swan program and is piloting something called SAGE, which is really about understanding and removing the barriers to women's progression in the STEM areas. In the innovation space, it's probably the hottest thing in the national policy debate at the moment, and as has already been mentioned, our PM, innovation is suddenly an acceptable word again.
Again, here it comes again.
But I mean, I think the fundamental thing right now is recognising that we have a huge gulf between the industries we have in Australia and what we're really good at in science. And it's about being patient and creating mechanisms and incentives that bridge those two together. While we publish 3% of the world's papers, we're at the bottom of the OECD tables in terms of how many PhDs are employed in industry and how much of that research gets out, and that's what we've got to change.
Now, may I quote the patron of the Science Media Centre, Alan Finkel, who is about to become the chief scientist. He said, we don't need any more reviews. We know pretty well what needs to be done. Now, Tanya, you are working in a field, photonics, where you can measure all sorts of things on jet aircraft, in wine bottles, and in babies' cribs. Now, you are working with industry to see how these ideas can be developed. How do you get on? How do you bridge the gap?
I think, it's a range of things. It's not on either just the university side or just the business side. There's serious things we need to do on both ends. I think once we've exposed our industries to the value, the creativity, the innovation, the lateral thinking that people trained in the way of thinking science can bring, we will change the employment pathways and prospects for those people. That's the first thing. From the university side, I think there's a little bit of a fear factor that working with an end user of your research removes your ability to do something fundamental and groundbreaking. And my personal experience with all of those examples you listed, Robin, is quite the opposite. It's some of the most practical, challenging, real everyday problems that have produced some of the most surprising fundamental research.
Yeah, but one of the problems that the business people say is that their timeline is we want to do it now, whereas the scientist says come back in 3 years when the 4 PhDs have finished their work. How do you bridge that time gap?
The way I find you do that is by building critical mass. You need to have teams of researchers across the whole career spectrum where you have enough capacity you can dedicate to deliver milestones, because if you don't deliver, they won't come back.
Cool. So leading on from that, just as we've spoken of a culture and a tectonic plate collision between scientists and the media, so one also exists between the investment community and the scientists. And one could almost sort of write out the different things of the timescales over which they work, the expectations they have the way they express themselves. So as Tanya said, in the private sector, as I'm now learning, people expect you to stick to very clear milestones, whereas when you apply for a grant, you wave your arms around, in my case, and say, I'm going to cure Alzheimer's and so on, but no one ties me down to a particular deadline. Yeah? Moreover, what scientists can't understand is why investors put a great premium on management. You know, why pay someone in a suit who's going to be a manager 3 times, you know, the salary of a postdoc, you know, when you could have a lot of slave labor in the lab. You know, why do you have to put a lot of effort and time into these management? And these are just 2 examples that I found.
But my sense of that is it's breaking down, that cultural divide.
Why'd you say that?
Well, I've just joined University of Technology Sydney, and one of my mantras and what I've been asked to do is to go and talk to all the other faculties and find people I can work with in the journalism space, from IT, from engineering, from law, from all sorts of places. So I think there is a real drive with that, because people understand that is
great.
fundamental to innovation is collaboration.
Yeah, that's great if it's starting, but I think my point is it's got a way to go. Certainly in the UK, at my university, Oxford, it's way to go in terms of making investors comfortable with scientists. Scientists don't know the kind of things investors want. They're frightened about patents, and they're frightened, whereas that can be dispelled. That
I think they're rather better at it in Cambridge, actually.
What's that? That's the other place.
They've got a technology park.
No, the other place.
But Peter, UTS has got the Frank Gehry building, where Roy Green, ex-CSIRO, is setting up a business school that looks at entrepreneurship. Now, I asked him, I don't know whether it started yet, whether the young people who are students could actually go to business before they've even graduated, so that they can get an experience of what it's like out there, working in the field, so that this gap gets closed even before they become qualified scientists.
What a great idea. I mean, I think. Look, to go back to the media, one of the things I'm going to spend 4 months early next year doing an entrepreneurial journalism thing, and I think I want to bring that back into this space, because I think if we have to not be scared of kind of taking risk, it boils down to taking risk and actually making some money.
And it also boils down to different cultures, of which there's 4 now that we're talking about: scientists, the media, investors, and dare I say it, politicians or policymakers. You know, they have to come into the mix. And so incidentally, that's why Peter and I were successful, because we had Mike Rand with us. We couldn't have done it without him. In order to do something, you need someone who has their finger on the button of policy and can actually make things happen, as opposed to speaking about it. So the fact that we're a good example, and that Peter had the investment expertise, I was the scientist, and Mike was the politician. So you need all 3.
Let me ask you finally, just 5 minutes, Science Media Centre, what could it do, first of all, to tell the bigger story, as we began, you know, the story that doesn't say that this latest subject landed from outer space and boing, you've got to behave differently because there's this news come in from nowhere. In other words, to tell the complete story. And secondly, to maybe put people together, you know, the scientists and the various elements that you mentioned, Tanya.
Look, I'd argue that we need to get much broader than just what we talk about as science. I think we need to bring together some of the latest research in decision-making and social sciences and the whole range of areas. You know, it's all very well to have a finding of, bacon causes cancer. But until you understand why people make the choices they make in their diets, or why messages that are given about healthy lifestyle choices aren't taken up, we can't actually tell the whole story. So, I mean, very few of the problems that we face in the real world can be tackled by any one discipline alone. I think we need to forge that narrative.
I couldn't agree any more with that, because take a field like automation. You know, 40-50% of the jobs are going to be affected by machine learning, by automation. There's a great project to be done, which the AusSMC could take the leadership, which is about, you know, educating people, involving and collaborating with scientists. Obviously, the media is part of that mix. There's sort of a project base. So rather than, oh my God, shock horror bacon, shock horror gene therapy, there is actually some deep sort of projects that can be done here. And there's a need for it. Yeah,
carrying on from that, one could convert scientific information, which is out there and easy, and get a monopoly on that here, scientific information into knowledge. That's the first thing. The second is to be a true engine of making a science culture, dare I say it like sport, but one where one's encouraging entrepreneurship, especially one's encouraging people who aren't white males to come into the science profession.
Oh, that's interesting. Tell me more. Thank you very much, Tanya, Peter, Susan.
Thank you.
Thank you. For the 8.
Big round of applause to our wonderful panellists. Robin Williams, we all know Robin so well, our Deputy Chairman. Tanya Munro, my goodness, one of Australia's great scientists. Also DVC here in South Australia, and of course on the Prime Minister's science panel, councillor rather. Baroness Susan Greenfield we know, and Peter Fray, besides the fact he's a professor, he happens also to be Deputy Editor at The Australian as well. So please give him a big round of applause. Is that not right? So we hope you've enjoyed our celebration. We hope you've enjoyed our show tonight. Please remain with us. I think the Twitter sphere apparently has gone crazy, so apparently that's really important. And so apparently we're trending number 1, certainly in South Australia, in the top 5 across Australia, and who knows in the next few hours across the world. You saw it here in Adelaide, the Australian Science Exchange. Thank you for joining us. And before I finish, could I particularly thank the Governor for being here. He is a passionate supporter of what we do, and I cannot forget earlier this year when the Duke of Kent came and the Governor kindly hosted a beautiful dinner at his home with about 10 early career research scientists. They felt like rock stars. They felt like sports stars. They were, they are. We thank you, Governor. Good night, Australia. Thank you for being with us.